Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And joining us today is Dr. Tom Mahnken, the president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, on this just about 75th anniversary of the Allied victory over Nazi Germany on May 8, 1945. Tom, thanks so very much for joining us for this conversation we've been having with leading strategists that's dedicated to the memory of Andy Marshall, the former director of the Office of Net Assessment, who was one of America's leading strategists.
Thanks, Vago. It's always a pleasure, and particularly a pleasure to be on this podcast.
Indeed, and I should point out to the audience that you're an author of a book that unfortunately came out in the middle of the pandemic on March 25th by Cambria Press. And it's on net assessment and military strategy. And the foreword was written by Andy Marshall, and it's got a lot of thought-provoking essays from a lot of leading strategists in it. So I commend the audience to check it out.
Thanks, Vago. The good byproduct of the current situation is people now have more time to read it. So hopefully they will.
Hopefully they will. And we're going to have you back on to make sure that we talk about that. But this is going to be a different conversation and somewhat more strategy-based. And it's a good opportunity to talk about strategy at a time when we're celebrating a truly strategic victory that resulted in a global order that the United States and its allies dominated and shaped, and organizations to ensure unprecedented economic prosperity, to avoid as much great power conflict as possible. I mean, obviously we had the Cold War, but the Cold War was very different from any sort of hot war that preceded it, and fostered an unprecedented growth in global democracy as well. All of which is a great opportunity to talk about strategy and get the perspective of someone like you who is a strategist and teaches the discipline and has been nurturing a new generation of strategists. As somebody who teaches strategy, how do you define strategy? Because there's sort of a debate, sort of a cart and horse or chicken and egg argument about strategy. Talk to us about how you see strategy and how you define it.
Thanks, Vago. That's a great question because people bandy about the S word, strategy, in all sorts of ways, and I can't claim that that my definition is the best, but it's kind of one that I've come to throughout my career. So my view of strategy is how you array limited resources in space and time to achieve your objectives against a competitor. And so first, it's about using your resources to achieve an objective, right? It's about achieving your political objectives. Second, it's an acknowledgement that by definition, your resources are limited. America's resources were limited even at the height of World War II, just to call back to VE Day. 1944, beginning in 1944, there were all sorts of concerns in Washington that we had reached the limits of our resources. So resources are by definition limited, and the question that strategy deals with is how do you array those resources best in space, but also in time. I think that the time dimension of strategy is really important and something that's often neglected. How do you array those limited resources in space and time to achieve your objectives against a competitor? So in my view, strategy is inherently competitive. You develop a strategy against a competitor. That means you don't always need strategy. Sometimes you just need planning. And so my definition of planning is similar to strategy, only minus the competition. Planning is about how you array your limited resources in space and time to achieve your objective. But for me, strategy is about dealing with a competitor, about achieving your objectives against a competitor. And it applies to the military realm, but it also applies to other realms as well. But that's the definition that I've come to over years, over decades, frankly.
There is a sense that we used to be very good at strategy, but that we're just sort of not ready for prime time anymore. That we see major challenges approaching, but we continually fail to respond accordingly with the kind of cold, clear-eyed, long-term approach that we used to have. And it goes beyond whether weapons take too long to develop and are no longer relevant by the time they're fielded. I mean, and it's possible, we talked about this many times, it's popular to say that America has never been able to predict the next war, which is just complete baloney, right? I mean, we were actually remarkably good at predicting and mapping out World War II. In the Pacific, we war gamed it so accurately, the only thing we didn't get was the kamikaze as something that would be used against us. Why do you think we're not as good at strategy as we used to be?
Well, Vago, you're right. The United States, and the United States government in a form similar to the form it exists in today, in the recent past, and I measure recent past in decades rather than years or months, did quite well at strategy, right? So yeah, I agree with you. It's not true that a democracy, a republic like the United States, can't formulate and implement good strategy, sound strategy over time. And actually, Wick Murray had a very good edited volume on sound strategy that I got an opportunity to contribute to a number of years ago. That included a whole bunch of positive cases. I think the reason that we haven't been as good as we could be, and as good as we have been in the past in recent years, again, it goes back to this notion of competition. And I think we experienced more or less a quarter century after the end of the Cold War, where we didn't really have to think about competition. So we didn't really have to think about strategy. We had to plan, but we didn't have to think about strategy, right? So the first decade after the end of the Cold War, it was us. It was the unipolar moment. It was the United States as a hyperpower to anglicize the French characterization of it. And then 15 plus years after that, it was all about counterterrorism. And so we didn't really have to think seriously about strategy. So I think we've gotten a little bit complacent, sort of like being out in space for a long time. Your muscles atrophy, and I think we've let our strategic muscles atrophy a little bit. Contrast that with the early Cold War, or the later Cold War, but the early Cold War, where we were able to do just tremendous things that required national effort and do them fairly rapidly. So I know you and I have talked about the Atlas program,
which your dad was involved in, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, peripherally, right? In one way, it was an amazing time because we developed and fielded ICBMs, something that had literally never been done, right? In the course of a small number of years. Pretty amazing, but again, realized that that was the United States. That was a federal system. That was a bureaucracy. The barriers, the structural barriers that existed then pretty much exist now. We didn't have infinite resources, and so we were able to do it then. Again, we had a sense of seriousness because we had a sense of what the downside risks were. And I think in the last quarter century, we've gotten away from having to think about what the downside risks of failure are.
I do think it's rather extraordinary. And as programs go, right, I mean, just imagine in 1955, between 1955 and 1960, we developed a ballistic missile submarine. The missile, the weapon, the ship, the CONOPS, the communications networks, and we did all of that in 5 years. And each one of the things was a revolutionary technology along the way, right? From a miniaturized warhead and guidance to being able to launch a missile underwater. I mean, it was a really incredible time. And I want to get to the notion of what we've done well over the decades, because you have a very historian's eye of things, right? You measure things in decades. Because every action has strategic implications, and history is sort of one long lesson in the laws of unintended consequences, right? President Hoover decides against helping banks, American banks, after the stock market collapsed, and instead they recall their German loans, and then that helps a guy named Adolf Hitler rise, right? Among many other factors, but that was an important factor because Hitler ran against the banks and the banking system and how everybody was mistreating Germany. Going into Iraq was a strategic blunder at the end of the day. There are people who look at, for example, America not helping its allies in their moment of need as something that may have strategic implications downstream as nationalism rises in all these countries, toxic nationalism rises. What are some good examples of strategic success, U.S. strategic success or allied strategic success? And what do you see as sort of failures?
In terms of successes, I'd just nominate two. I could go on, but and then they really bookend, they bookend the Cold War. So first, the development of our initial strategy for competing with the Soviet Union, strategy of containment, but much more than that. I mean, I think there's this tendency to look back and attribute everything or most everything to George Kennan. I think that's it's a major mistake, and it actually I think it does disservice to the many people that were involved in implementing our strategy. I mean, I always like to say that strategies are developed by individuals to be implemented by large organizations, right? So you can have the most brilliant idea, but if it fails the bureaucracy test, if it fails first contact with the bureaucracy, it's just a historical artifact, right? Oh, somebody wrote this memo. Wow, wonderful. Well, what happened to it, right? So I think the real success of our early post World War II strategy was that it was institutionalized, and those institutions took shape over years. Again, it wasn't like somebody just flipped a light switch and all of a sudden containment and all the instruments of great power competition emerged. They emerged over time. But what you had, by the late 50s, certainly was a whole set of institutions for competing with the Soviet Union across multiple dimensions. So that's a clear success. And in the book that I referred to earlier, Wick Murray's book on sound strategy, my former colleague and continuing friend Brad Lee has a great chapter on that. And then at the end of the Cold War, what wound up being the end of the Cold War, because it wasn't inevitable, I would say the Reagan strategy, or the Carter-Reagan strategy, late 70s into the 80s, another great example of successful strategy. And that flowed from, I think, first and foremost, a superior net assessment of the balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in that way, I think Ronald Reagan was a heretic. He was a heretic within his own party. He was a heretic on the right of the American political spectrum, in that as he looked at the balance between the United States and Soviet Union, whereas most conservatives and most Republicans and many Democrats saw a weak America and a strong Soviet Union, Reagan saw American strength and saw deep reservoirs of American strength, and saw some real pockets of weakness in the Soviet Union. And the Reagan strategy was really built on that net assessment. It was really built to exploit American strengths and exploit them against enduring Soviet weaknesses. Those are two successes. Failures, we can talk about Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam's been talked about seemingly ad infinitum. You can talk about Iraq. I think in the failures, though, I think if we're honest with ourselves, if we're going to give policymakers credit for all the successes, and we're going to excoriate them for the failures, we do have to think about the world as they found it, not as it turned out. And so whether it's Vietnam or Iraq, we need to say, well, what were the alternatives? What would have happened if we hadn't acted in Vietnam, for example? Or what would have happened, if we had taken a different tack? Because again, that's the world of the policymaker. The historian gets to look back, with the luxury of hindsight and past judgment. But those of us who've been in policymaking positions, we don't have that luxury. And you mentioned Andy Marshall at the outset of this, and I just, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking back to a number of conversations that he and I had, and even at the very end of his life, he was still asking questions about the Cold War and about the US-Soviet arms competition, and whether it needed to go the way that it actually went. What were the paths not taken? And I think as we think about strategy and as we assess past strategy, that's something we have to do. Not just what happened and why, but the other things that might have happened and how things might have been better or worse if we'd taken those other paths. Being open to that, I think, is really important, because again, that's the world of the policymaker. You don't get to run the natural experiment and then go back and redo it, right? You only get one chance.
Well, as I recall, you were in the Bush administration, at that time, and I know that there was a debate. But at the end of the day, once the leadership decides to do something, everybody is obligated to try to figure out the best way to try to execute that at the end of the day, which does create its own challenges. And certainly in Andy's case, he did so much clear and compelling work, not just throughout the Cold War in terms of how to posture and position ourselves, whether it was sort of better understanding and exploiting the third offset strategy, building, I think, anti-submarine warfare pressures on the Soviet Union that were unsustainable and cost imposing on the Soviet Union, all the way to sort of being early in the work on sort of understanding China and how best to respond to it. And, having discussed this with him as well, the sort of the frustration that, the warning signs were there and we could have better prepared sooner for China. I think now people are focused on the issue and are moving. So I think that his work was a success ultimately. But it's sort of the speed with which we understand and bound a challenge and respond to it. Let me ask you, do you think that there's a paucity of strategic focus elsewhere as well, right, in other fields, whether it's in government or outside government?
Well, look, I think whether it's government or outside government, you have people who are natural strategists. And when I say this, I'm not, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that, the propensity for strategic thinking somehow makes somebody better or anything. It's like anything else, right? It's like athletic ability or numeracy or anything else. It's just a skill that's not equally and evenly divided across the population, right? So not everybody has equal foot speed. Not everybody is equally good with numbers. And I'd say not everybody thinks strategically, right? So you have a group of folks who are just natural strategists. And by the way, most of them probably never took a course in strategy, never had any formal education, right? So Bill Belichick, I would hazard to guess, is a natural strategist. Pete Carroll is a natural strategist. Whether they ever studied strategy or read a book of strategy, I don't know. They're strategists. They're strategic thinkers, right? And then if you believe that, makes perfect sense. Then there's some other folks on the other end of the distribution who wouldn't recognize strategy if it snuck up on them with a baseball bat in the dark alley, right? They're just not. They just don't think strategically. Just like some of us aren't good enough with numbers, right? Or some of us aren't fast. But then there's the whole part of the population in between, right? And those are the people who can be educated to think strategically and recognize strategy. Right. And I think that's sort of the most interesting, most relevant part of the population. Right. Because, the geniuses, if you will, well, okay, they're geniuses. It's already God-given talent. And the folks who are hopeless, well, they're already hopeless. Where the gains can be made are in that middle population. And I think, that's across society. I mean, you certainly, again, I mentioned sports, but you see it in business, you see it in a whole bunch of areas where people are strategic thinkers, or they just aren't, and by the way, you can have perfect success if you're not a strategic thinker.
That's a good one. As somebody who teaches strategy, what's the best way to teach it, to inculcate it, to cultivate it, and to sort of grow back skills?
Yeah, I think history is really powerful. I think being able to, see how it has been done successfully in the past. I think biography is also really powerful. Again, to see how great men and women have tackled problems, but then then doing. I think getting your hands dirty and actually really trying to think through a problem is extremely important, because it's one thing to admire or critique a problem or a leader, right? Oh, he was so brilliant, or she was so brilliant, or so stupid. But then to actually have to work it out. So a lot of, I think, practical work, asking questions. This is another thing I got from Andy Marshall is the value of questioning, of posing the right question, and that's much more difficult than it first appears. And then figuring out how to actually get the information, how to get the data to answer the question. So a lot of real practical work, and I think in that that helps determine, or do you have a knack for it? Do you have a real passion for strategy or not? And again, either answer is perfectly acceptable. It says nothing about your self-worth, your future earning prospects, your marriageability, anything like that. But it's all about self-knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. As marriage criteria, I want strategic foresight, right? That's got to be, that's something rather foundational.
It's a blessing and a curse.
It's a blessing and a curse, exactly. Can a good or even a great strategy work if the leader of the organization doesn't really believe in it?
Well, so look, I think that, so I look back and I think the Cold War is a good case study, right? Because we have decades of experience there, multiple presidential administrations, Democrats, Republicans. First thing I would say is, and it's stating the obvious, but it's worth stating. The American people don't elect presidents based on whether they're strategists or not, right? Again, if we look at the Cold War lineup of presidents, there were a couple there who, in retrospect, you could say, yep, they were real strategic thinkers. Others who fell in that my category of educable, or sort of interested in strategy, not natural strategists. And there were others who just didn't care about it. And yet, our strategy in the Cold War persisted, was adapted. So that's just the first point, right? So we don't elect strategists in chief. We're not like the Athenians. We don't elect strategoi and out of our midst to lead us. And by the way, that had a very mixed success rate for the Athenians. So there's that. So there is something to be said for a strategy that emerges or is sustained by the bureaucracy. I think it's more the latter than the former, though. I mean, I do think it takes leadership to bring a strategy into existence and get it going. So particularly when it comes to things like institution building, strategic direction, impetus, resources. But again, if we go back to the Cold War, there were times when strategic leadership was absent. So I think it's very mixed, and sometimes sometimes leaders lead, and sometimes leaders follow. Jimmy Carter came to office with a certain mandate and a certain set of views, and it's clear that at least some of those views and many of his policies changed during his time in office. So I think it's mixed. I'd say, is it desirable to have a president that's a strategic thinker? Yep. Is it desirable to have presidential direction? Yep. But in a political system like ours, none of those things are guaranteed.
but good leaders always have a tendency of surrounding themselves and seeking out strategists to build those kind of successful organizations and models to be successful in highly contested spaces, right? Because you can have a strategy and have a bad strategy and execute a bad strategy well that puts you in a worse place, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, no, well, and you're right. And look, Peter Rodman wrote, a wonderful book, unfortunately published posthumously, called Presidential Command. And it's all about the difficulty that presidents have enforcing their will, even on their cabinet members, individuals who in the end owe their jobs to the president. There's a recurring tug and pull there, between the president and his cabinet officials.
Let's talk about China a little bit, and it's beginning to dawn on folks that China is not likely to fight us the way we would like them to fight us, or we think that they will fight us, which is sort of force on force. And Bob Work joined us some weeks ago on this podcast, and that's been a message that he's been delivering for some time, that the Chinese have a systems warfare approach and how they're going to wage it. And it's going to involve cyber attacks on the homeland. I mean, it's going to be something very, very different than the kinetic force on force that we tend to think about in war. And if you look at it, almost every peer adversary in the world knows that kind of a peer conflict is going to be highly problematic. It's going to be very deadly. It's going to be very expensive. So if you're Russia or China, you try to compete in hybrid ways of sort of constantly undermining, fighting through disinformation, and then identifying ways to take down those networks in the event that you do need to do something. You can actually succeed without being as kinetic as we may have been in the past. What is war in this modern, interconnected global context? I mean, are we thinking about war the right way?
That's a great question. I think by and large the answer is no. So at least to your second question.
Okay, everybody, listen. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, come back for part two. So I think as Americans, I think it's pretty deeply seated in our culture that we see war as an aberration. We see peace as the natural state of things, and war is an occasional annoyance, right? So we live in a state of peace, wars break out, we have to fight them, and then we go back to peace. I think that's a very long-term American cultural predisposition. And we think dichotomously, right? So it's either war or it's peace. Our legal system is set up, right, that way. Our legal authorities are set up that way. I'm persuaded that that's not the way the Chinese leadership sees things. And it's not the way the Chinese Communist Party leadership sees things, but I also say more generally, that's not in the Chinese tradition. I think the Chinese tradition, we could talk about Russia too, because I think there actually are some similarities, but let's focus on China. They see things much more graduated, right? So whereas we see, war versus peace, they see a spectrum. And whereas, we, the Joint Staff until recently had its, 6-phase conflict model, phase 0 through phase 5. Again, the Chinese approach is much more varied. Whereas we stovepipe things, either this is a military problem, this is a Title X problem, or diplomatic, or informational. Again, I think they have a much more integrated approach. So I'd say at a fundamental level, they have a very different way of looking at matters of war, conflict, and peace than we do. And I would say also, they have been thinking strategically. As the weaker power, they need to think strategically. So they're thinking, and they have been thinking, all about our strengths and our weaknesses and how to exploit them. To kind of, go back to something we were talking about at the outset, we, until recently, haven't seen the need to think strategically, right? Instead, we've been thinking, okay, well, we can just execute our preferred vision of war. Which, look, if you're really strong and your adversary is really weak, you can do that. You can just do whatever you want because if you're Alabama and you're playing North Texas, you can probably do whatever you want. if you're and the SEC loves to schedule patsies for numerous games. But anyway, but if you're the number one team and the number two team playing each other, you really have to think strategy. You really have to think strengths and weaknesses, right? And so the Chinese have had to think about our strengths and weaknesses because they have been weaker than us. We, with our seeming strengths, haven't had to. But now we're in a position where we really have to.
I can see you're very starved for sports, like so many other people. I know people are putting old ball games on because there's a mutual friend of ours, by the way, who's been watching Korean baseball for no other reason than there is no other baseball out there.
It's truly terrible. It's truly terrible.
I will avoid comment not to offend our Korean listeners.
Oh yeah, I didn't mean Korean baseball was truly terrible. I was meaning that the situation we're in is truly terrible.
Ah, right. That's right. Well, good recovery on that, Tom. There is a tendency of portraying China as 10 feet tall. And that was a little bit of the same case for the Soviet Union, but Beijing obviously is a very, very different adversary. Soviet Union was isolated from the world technologically and economically, whereas China is a first-rank technological, economic, diplomatic, and military power. It's fully integrated into the world economy. And unlike the Soviet Union, where we didn't have a lot of insight into what was going on in the Soviet Union unless an emigre showed up, right? Or there was a Kennan that had a sort of a brilliant insight that became sort of a foundational document that steered us. There's a lot of information and insight that we do have about China.
Mm-hmm.
What's the right way to be thinking strategically about this adversary? Because there are folks who are concerned, and every administration gets some stuff right and some stuff wrong, when it comes to our, sort of approach to long-term adversaries. What's the right way to sort of be thinking about this from a strategic context?
Well, I think we are, we're entering the third phase of conceptualizing China as a competitor. That first phase, really going back to the early 1990s, was essentially to disregard China, right? To come up with all the reasons why China and the Chinese military was weak, wasn't really a competitor, to discount China in various ways. And then we got to the second phase where, as a competitor, China was 10 feet tall, nothing but strengths. The third phase, I think, is the real strategic phase, which is to realize that China has real strengths, but also real weaknesses. And strategy is made, and strategic benefit accrues to those who can figure out, those relative strengths and weaknesses, and particularly how to exploit those weaknesses, right? So, in that sense, when we think about competition is about doing things, but it's also about gathering information. Right? So if we think about, and you can see it, if we go back to, again, because I am so sports deprived, all I can think of is sports, right? So whether I love defense. That's my vice. I love defense. And fencing is a strategic sport, like tennis is another strategic sport, or boxing. right? It's all about interaction. It's all about doing things and gathering information about your opponent. Before you fence somebody, or before you play tennis with somebody, you can size them up, across the court. Are they tall, short, fat, thin, left-handed, right-handed? You gather some basic information. But it's in competing that you really figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are. What are their predilections? What are their proclivities? And how you can exploit them. So we're now, I think, entering that third phase. And we went through the same thing, in the Cold War. Not, by the way, not saying that we're going into another Cold War, not saying that China's the Soviet Union, but again, just stick with me for the for the broader purpose, right? Which was, at first it was sort of discarding or discounting the Soviet Union. Then it was, oh my gosh, they can do anything, they're superhuman. And then over time it was realizing, no, they have strengths, they have things that they do well. They may have a great backhand, but there are other things that they don't. So I think that's really where we are. And as you say, with China, we actually have some benefits that we didn't have in a former era, which is China is an authoritarian state. They do hide a lot of information. I think, as we're seeing with COVID pandemic, they hide all sorts of information. But we also get a lot of information. We're getting a lot of information from the Chinese people on a daily basis, and the information environment is such that it's in many ways it's harder to conceal things. So whereas the Soviets were able to conceal all sorts of things, I think it's marginally more difficult for the Chinese to do that. And just in the process of governing a state that is so large, so populous, there's so much that the Chinese Communist Party has to do and has to broadcast to its subordinate organs and to the people that I think is tremendously useful in telling us what it is that they fear, what is it that they're concerned about. So there's a lot of information available now that we're attuned to it, or are becoming attuned to it, that can help us develop sound strategy.
Competition ultimately is about leadership, and leadership is necessary to marshal national will. And there is a real debate about whether or not America has the kind of will that's necessary in some cases. The political parties have become very, very toxic. Inequality is a challenge. I mean, one of the things that FDR, I think, said rightly is, if you don't have security at home, in your home or in your life, it's very, very hard to think about security sort of more broadly, right? And that's a message even somebody who's significantly right of center, Liam Fox, former British Defense Secretary, Dr. Fox says that all the time, right? I mean, if you don't have economic security at home and in your personal life, it's very, very hard for you to envision or conceptualize security more broadly. And ultimately all great empires come to an end, right? I mean, when you study history, you see that, whether or not it's a several hundred-year empire or if it's something that's a briefer empire. How do leaders have to lead in an environment, right? Because unless democracies show that they can be successful as democracies, authoritarians win, because they can say, there's the relativism, there's whataboutism, and look, I mean, they can't make it work, and we're all about getting stuff done. And getting stuff done is a lot harder when everybody does have access to social media and have their opinions and have bullhorns to be able to say, like, Mahnken's stupid, Esper's dumb. How do you lead in this? How do you strategically lead in this environment?
Yeah, I think it's so the environment is affecting us. It's affecting us politically, domestically. Of course, it's also affecting China. I don't want to make this just about us or China. I think it's obviously it's a global phenomenon. But it's also affecting the Chinese Communist Party. So I guess the question is, how do are, in the end, are democracies or authoritarian regimes better suited to this, to this environment? And I think that's, I think, we see authoritarian regimes really trying to co-opt, the information environment. That having been said, I have a deep and abiding faith in democracy. And I think, when it comes to leadership, there's top-down leadership, and we certainly need that. But there's also bottom up. So I mean, I think if you look at the way people's attitudes have changed towards China in recent years, some of it's because of what leaders have said, but in many cases, leaders are just saying what more and more people know to be true about Chinese behavior, right? And whether it's their militaristic behavior towards their neighbors, whether it's their domestic behavior, more and more different people find that to be objectionable. So there is something to say about the need to bring the population along, but there's also, I think, particularly in the current environment, a popular reaction to things that the Chinese are doing. And it's worth, again, you have me back, thinking historically. If we think back to responses to Nazi Germany, for example, in the 1930s, some of those were driven from the top, but others were driven by the actions of individual citizens who saw what Hitler was doing, or saw what the Nazis were doing, including what the Nazis were trying to do in the United States, by the way, the Nazi agitation efforts in the United States, and took action. So I think it's both top down and bottom up.
I will still say that it was when war was declared, what was it, sort of like 25% of the American people were still somehow sympathizing with Germany, which I think is sort of an interesting statistic. And I think that folks don't understand how powerful that isolationist movement in the United States was to not get involved, because some of the biggest rallies ever in New York history were the America First rallies that spilled out of Madison Square Garden onto the streets.
That's true, but it's also true that isolationist sentiment evaporated really, in the 48, 72 hours, again, in a pre-internet era, right? In the radio era, within 48 to 72 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that isolationist sentiment virtually evaporated. That was very remarkable. But you're right, it persisted up until that. And one would hope that it doesn't, wouldn't take another Pearl Harbor to realign things.
We certainly hope so. Hope not. And certainly, right, it went a little, opposing Nazis was a little bit easier in the United States than actually being in Germany and trying to push back against Nazis, which worked out somewhat less well.
Absolutely.
Let me just ask you one last question about international organizations. After World War I, nations said that they were never going to let a war like that happen again. And then effectively everybody sort of failed to do their part. Everybody acted with enormous self-interest. And then it happened again, just worse. And after that, everybody realized that we've got to build organizations that bring economically nations together, weld them together, and try to avoid war at that level ever happening again. And it worked. It worked remarkably well. The problem is, when things work, the farther you get from the badness, the less you remember. You know what I mean? The more nationalistic you can get, the more you focus and worry about the other. And then all of a sudden you recognize that you're really toying with some of the forces that have been the most deadly in sort of human history. What's the right strategy now at a time when these sort of foundational institutions are showing a lot of strain? Are these institutions important? And if they're important, how do we make them work to avoid something very bad happening again?
recent years, and here I'll say recent years again, verging onto small numbers of decades, but at least with in the post-war, post-Cold War world, the premise was universalism, right? So you create something like the World Trade Organization, or and what you're trying to do is bring countries like China into the order, right? And to universalize everything, and based on the premise that, kind of a paternalistic premise when you think about it, that just by letting them into these organizations, you'll educate them and you'll tame them. Well, no, that didn't work, right? It's pretty clear that didn't work, and that China has taken advantage of its participation in international organizations in many ways. I mean, not just to take advantage of the rules, but also then to kind of shut others out. And I think that the shameful treatment of Taiwan by the World Health Organization is just a good, it's just the most recent example of that. So I think back to what you said about democracies, Vago. I think democracies need to band together. We need to stand up for the things that we value, that we care about, realizing that they although they may be universal aspirations, it's not the universal reality. And I think first and foremost, we need to safeguard democratic institutions, democratic values, and we need to work even closer with other democratic states, without presuming that we're going to be able to change the minds, change the behaviors of authoritarian states. Not that we shouldn't try, not that we should, but that we shouldn't presume it. I think that's where we are, and I think you captured it nicely. I mean, I was born 2 decades after the end of World War II. My father was a World War II veteran. That experience was very much still front of mind, and it's much more removed today. Even the Cold War experience is removed from the thinking of so many people. They grew up in the post-Cold War world, the 9/11 world, and they're going to have to learn some of the things that some of us experienced and others of us studied.
Look, I think that Adam Smith is definitely onto something. When he says that that a key part of the competition is showing everybody in the world that democracy works. That it's not only the best form of government, but it's actually the most efficient and effective form of government. And hopefully, I think folks recognize the strategic global implications of sort of a quagmired domestic political process that for all the world, because we're the leader. I mean, we bear a burden being the leader, but there are advantages to being the leader. And that's something which I hope there will be a broader recognition of. And alas, that's one of the reasons we're doing this series, is to talk about strategy and why keeping an eye on long-term challenges is something, and thinking about them and how to counter them and skate to those pucks is something that's vitally important. Tom, thanks very much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Really appreciate the insights, and look forward to having you back on again soon, so that we can have you talking about your book about net assessment, as somebody who's a giant net assessment fan and a giant Andy Marshall fan.
Thanks, Vago. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman, and our broader Navy coverage that's sponsored by Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.